Jack Thompson, a highly respected and influential businessman, paced back and forth in his luxurious office in the heart of New York City, with a lump in his throat. The sprawling city below was visible from the towering windows, but his thoughts weren't on money or potential deals that could make him even wealthier. No, his mind was preoccupied with his son, Robert. Robert had always been a spoiled young man, accustomed to luxury and privilege. Jack had given him everything: the best education, the best connections, and a life free of worries. But instead of becoming the responsible man Jack had hoped for, Robert had chosen a path filled with excesses, endless parties, and poor decisions. Not a week passed without some scandal involving his son reaching Jack's ears. This morning, however, the phone call that Jack received was the final straw. Robert had thrown yet another one of his extravagant parties, this time renting out a large house for the event. The excess alcohol, unruly guests, and news that some of his friends had damaged property were the last drops in an already overflowing cup. Jack Thompson took a deep breath, clenching his fists. "This can't go on," he muttered to himself. He knew he had to act decisively. But this time, things would be different. It was no longer enough to simply scold Robert or freeze his accounts for a few days. No, this time, his son needed to learn a real-life lesson. "Mr. Thompson," interrupted his assistant, a professional and composed woman, "your son is here." Jack slowly turned, his face tense from the decision he had made. "Let him in," he said firmly. Robert entered the office with the same careless manner as always. He wore dark sunglasses, which couldn't hide the dark circles under his eyes from his wild night. "So, what now, Dad? Another lecture about responsibility?" Robert said sarcastically as he slumped into the chair across from his father's desk. Jack Thompson looked at him in silence for a few seconds. Robert always had a way of downplaying everything as if consequences didn't affect him. But this time, things would be different. "Robert, this isn't a game anymore. You've crossed the line too many times, and that's it. Your life cannot go on like this. You're 27 years old and don't even know what it means to earn a living through honest work," Jack began in a low voice. Robert sighed, rolling his eyes. "Seriously? Is this another one of your motivational lectures? Because if it is, I don't have time for this." Jack leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "No, this time it's different. I've made a decision. And trust me, you'll like it less than you think." Something in his father's tone caught Robert's attention. There was something in the way he spoke that made Robert frown. "What are you saying? You're getting married?" Robert laughed. "Married? You've lost your mind. I'm not marrying anyone. I don't have the time or the desire." Jack didn't blink. "You're marrying Mary? Mary? Who is Mary?" "Mary is a simple, hardworking woman, a dairy farmer. She lives in the countryside, a woman with real values. You're going to marry her, and you'll live with her on her farm. This will be your new life." Silence hung in the office. Robert shot up, his eyes full of disbelief. "What are you talking about? You can't make me marry some farmer. You really think I'm going to go along with this? You don't have a choice anymore, Robert. Either you accept this, or you're left with nothing. I'm tired of your games, your excesses. This marriage is the only way to save you from yourself." Robert clenched his fists, feeling a wave of hot anger surge through him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You can't do this to me. This is insane. I can and I will. It's already decided. In a week, you're marrying Mary, and after that, you'll start living a real life. No more parties, no more luxuries, just hard work and responsibility." Robert glared at his father, but there wasn't a hint of doubt on Jack's face. He was resolute, and Robert knew that this time, there was no turning back. Robert stormed out of the office, feeling the weight of an enormous burden settling on his shoulders. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Marry a farmer? How could his father be so cruel, so tyrannical? His life was about to turn into complete madness, and all because of Jack's whim. "He's lost his mind," Robert thought bitterly. On the way home, Robert was consumed by his thoughts. There was no way he, Robert Thompson, the heir to one of the most influential families in the country, could end up married to a woman he didn't even know. "This is madness," he muttered, pressing down on the gas pedal, feeling his anger build up in his chest. At home, he immediately headed to his minibar and poured himself some whiskey, neat. "This can't be happening," he repeated to himself over and over, taking a sip. "My father's lost it." Robert's phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from one of his friends, inviting him to another party. But what once would have excited Robert now seemed meaningless. He knew that his old life was coming to an end. There was no way out. If he didn't listen to his father, he would lose everything. Robert sat heavily on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. "What if I just refuse?" he asked himself. But he knew his father well. Jack Thompson wasn't a man who made empty threats. If Robert didn't comply with his demands, everything he had would disappear from his life. "Damn it," he yelled, throwing the glass against the wall and watching it shatter into pieces. The sound of breaking glass filled the silence of his luxurious apartment, but despite all his anger, Robert knew he had no other options. His life, his fancy apartment, his sports car, all of it depended on whether he fulfilled his father's whim. And the worst part of it all was that Jack wasn't going to back down. For the next few days, Robert tried to find a way out, consulting with lawyers and close friends. He wanted to salvage at least something, maybe take his car and escape from the city, or better yet, leave the country altogether, sell the car, and live on that money for a while. But everything led to the same conclusion: his father controlled all the family assets, all the properties, both movable and immovable. If Robert didn't go through with the marriage, he would lose access to everything. No lawyer was willing to go against Jack Thompson. Finally, on a warm Friday evening, Robert appeared once again in his father's office. This time, his usual arrogant demeanor was gone. He knew that resistance was futile. "So, what have you decided?" Jack asked without looking up from the documents on his desk, as if his son's answer didn't matter at all, and in truth, it didn't. Robert gritted his teeth. His pride fought against the humiliation, but there were no other options. "I'll do it," he replied dryly, though he knew this was a bad idea. Jack finally looked up, watching his son with a mixture of satisfaction and indifference to his feelings. "Wise decision, Robert. This marriage is the best thing that could happen to you. Though you may not understand it now." Robert felt a dull anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain silent. There was no point in arguing. His father had already made up his mind. "The wedding will take place next Saturday," Jack continued, turning his attention back to the documents on his desk. "No extravagance, just the essentials. Then you'll move to Mary's farm and start your new life." The words "new life" echoed in Robert's head like a heavy bell. There was nothing more terrifying to him than the thought of leaving everything he had for a life he couldn't even imagine. "And who is this Mary?" Robert asked irritably. Jack looked at him like he was an insignificant detail. "Mary is everything you're not. Hardworking, responsible, and wise. She's exactly what you need in life. Maybe if you learn something from her, you'll finally become the man I always hoped you would be." Robert didn't reply, knowing that any words would only make the situation worse, but inside, his hatred for his father slowly grew. He left the office silently, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on his shoulders. In a week, his life would change forever, but Robert didn't yet know that this marriage, which he saw as a punishment, would shake the very foundations of his worldview. The day finally arrived. Robert, with a mixture of disbelief and resignation, drove toward the farm where Mary lived. He sat in the back seat of his car, and as the cityscape faded away, giving way to endless fields, his mind kept returning to the same thought: this can't be real. This must be a nightmare. But it was reality, and with every passing mile that distanced him from the city, he was getting closer to a life he had never imagined. The car stopped in front of a modest but well-maintained house. The facade was simple, with a small garden full of flowers that Mary had planted with her own hands, though Robert didn't know that yet. The contrast with his luxurious city life was almost laughable. Stepping out of the car, Robert looked around with disdain. "This is my future?" he thought bitterly, taking a deep breath. Mary came out to greet him with such calm confidence that it caught Robert off guard. She was a young woman, very beautiful, with a determined look that spoke of someone accustomed to hard work. She wore simple clothes, no expensive makeup or fancy dresses like the women Robert was used to, but there was an undeniable beauty in her natural simplicity. "Hello, Robert," she said quietly, extending her hand in a gesture of greeting. Robert looked her over from head to toe, not hiding his disdain. This was the woman he was supposed to spend the rest of his life with? A simple dairy farmer who knew nothing of luxury or refinement. But, swallowing his pride, he extended his hand and shook hers lightly, showing no real interest. "I guess you already know why I'm here," Robert said indifferently. "This wasn't my idea, my father forced me into this, so I'm not here by choice." Mary met his gaze steadily, unaffected by his coldness. She already knew everything about Robert, about his city life, the parties, and the chaos he created. For her, this marriage was a sacrifice she was willing to make for the sake of her family and the farm, which could no longer survive without outside help. "I know," Mary said, not breaking eye contact. "This isn't what either of us wants, but it's what's been decided." Robert felt uneasy by Mary's calmness. He had expected to meet a meek, submissive girl resigned to her fate, but Mary didn't fit that image at all. There was a quiet strength in her that unsettled him. "Yeah, this is the life waiting for me," Robert said, glancing around with a grimace. "I guess my father thinks this is exactly what I need." You don't have to stay if you don't want to, Mary said simply, her openness catching him off guard for a moment. I won't force you to do anything, you're not interesting to me either. Robert stared at her in confusion. He hadn't expected such a reaction. She was supposed to be grateful. After all, he was Robert Thompson, the son of a wealthy man. How could she dare to speak to him so plainly? I guess I'll have to get used to it, he finally replied, stuffing his hands into his pockets. This life isn't for me, but if my father wants it, I'll endure. This isn't about what your father wants or doesn't want, Mary interrupted him softly but firmly. It's about what we can build together and whether you're willing to try. Robert fell silent, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by a woman like Mary. Well, we'll see how it goes, he finally muttered. Mary didn't say anything else. She invited him into the house and showed him around the place, which, to Robert's surprise, would now be his new home. The walls of the house were lined with photographs of Mary's family, images that told stories of sacrifice and hard work, things completely foreign to Robert. As they walked through the house, Robert couldn't shake the growing feeling of discomfort. Everything here seemed too simple, too ordinary. But deep down, there was something about this place that disturbed him. Maybe, for a fleeting moment, he thought this life wasn't so bad after all. But he quickly pushed that thought aside. He wasn't ready to accept this reality. At the end of the tour, Mary left him alone in his new room. Robert sat on the bed, looking around. He grimaced slightly. His entire life had changed in a matter of days, and now he found himself trapped in a world he didn't understand, next to a woman he barely knew. The next morning, when Robert opened his eyes, the sun was just starting to peek through the windows of his new room. The quiet of the countryside enveloped him, completely unlike the noisy hum of the city he was used to. Only the roosters crowing loudly, which irritated Robert, broke the silence. He slowly sat up, realizing that this day was unlike any of the previous ones. Today, he was supposed to marry a woman he barely knew and didn't love at all. The reality of it hit him with unexpected force, like a slap in the face. The wedding was planned as a simple ceremony, far from the lavish extravagance and glamour that usually surrounded such events in his former life. There were no invited celebrities, no grand halls adorned with exotic flowers. Everything would take place in a small village church with a few neighbors that Mary had invited to the celebration. For Robert, this wedding was a symbol of his defeat to his father, and with every reminder of it, his hatred for the situation only grew stronger. At the appointed time, Jack Thompson arrived at the village, impeccably dressed as always. Unlike Robert, who wore a modest suit bought at his father's request from a second-hand store. Jack observed his son from a distance with a cold, satisfied smile. He had won, his son had finally submitted. And though the situation was awkward for everyone, Jack was confident that this was the only way to fix Robert. The small church was filled with villagers, people who had known Mary since childhood and deeply respected her. For them, Robert was an outsider. Many whispered among themselves, wondering how such a hardworking and dedicated woman like Mary could marry a man whose reputation in the city was far from ideal, this spoiled failure. Robert stood at the altar, frowning as soft music filled the air. As the minutes dragged on, tension filled his body. He didn't want to be here. Everything inside him screamed to run away, to get into his car and disappear. But he knew it would only make things worse. His father would destroy him if he tried to escape. When the church doors opened, all eyes turned to Mary. She walked toward the altar with such calm determination that it commanded everyone's attention. She wore a simple white dress, without any elaborate decorations, but her natural elegance was unmatched. Her head was held high, but her eyes betrayed a mixture of emotions. Though she had accepted this marriage, she knew it wasn't what she had dreamed of. However, her resolve to move forward was stronger than her doubts. Robert couldn't take his eyes off her, feeling a strange mix of discomfort and curiosity. Despite the absurdity of the situation, marrying a woman he knew nothing about, something inside him made him watch her every step, as if he sensed that this day would mark the beginning of something new and necessary for him. When Mary finally reached the altar, silence hung in the air. The priest began the ceremony with his usual formality, but Robert barely heard his words. His mind was far away, stuck between anger at his father and frustration at being forced into this marriage. "Robert Thompson, do you take Mary Williams to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the priest asked, pulling Robert out of his thoughts. Robert blinked, feeling the world around him freeze. He looked at Mary, who watched him with a calmness that frightened him. He knew there was no turning back, that his answer would determine his life from this moment on. "Yes, I do," he finally said, tense but firm. The priest asked Mary the same question, and without hesitation, she answered. "Yes, I do." From that moment, their fates were irrevocably tied. Robert felt trapped, unable to escape, while Mary, though calm, also felt the weight of the commitment she had taken on. There was no love between them, only an agreement forced upon them by circumstances beyond their control. After the ceremony, Jack Thompson approached Robert and Mary with an expression that left no room for doubt. He had gotten what he wanted. His son was married, bound to the life Jack deemed appropriate to correct his mistakes. Robert barely glanced at his father. He knew Jack was pleased, and it only deepened his internal resentment. "I hope now you'll start living like a real man," Jack said firmly. Robert said nothing, remaining silent as he watched Mary say her goodbyes to the neighbors who had come to the wedding. For him, this marriage was a prison, but for Mary, despite her doubts, it was a chance at stability and an opportunity to support her family and farm. When they returned to Mary's house, the day felt incredibly long. Robert sat in the living room while Mary, as usual, started preparing something in the kitchen. They both remained silent, neither saying a word, as if the reality of what had just happened hadn't fully sunk in. Robert looked around, realizing that this was now his new home. The next morning, waking up again to the sound of crowing roosters, he felt a strange sensation. He missed the familiar noise of the city. Here, everything was too quiet, only birds and the wind created a barely noticeable background. He sat up in bed and looked around. Too simple. Too foreign. The room had none of the luxurious furniture or decorations he was used to. He remembered that today would be his first full day on the farm, in the new home he had reluctantly accepted. Weeks passed since the wedding. Despite Robert's attempts to adapt to his new life, every morning on the farm felt more suffocating. The constant physical labor, the absence of the comforts he had once taken for granted, and the chaotic city life he used to enjoy all weighed heavily on him. He tried to pretend he could manage, but his internal tension only grew. Mary noticed how distant Robert had become. Although he tried to help around the farm, his mood worsened daily. Robert felt trapped, and one morning, while Mary was out working in the field, he made a decision. He knew he couldn't stay on the farm any longer. He craved freedom, a return to the city where he truly felt alive. Hastily packing a few belongings in a backpack, Robert left a brief note on the kitchen table. "I'm sorry, Mary, but I can't do this. I'm leaving." With that, he set off down the road, hoping to hitch a ride back to the city. Robert found refuge with his old friends in the city center. They were thrilled to see him and didn't ask too many questions. Together, they resumed the lifestyle Robert knew and loved: parties, nightclubs, and luxurious apartments. For a few days, it felt like he had finally returned to his old life. But as the nights wore on, a nagging feeling crept in. In the quiet moments after the parties, when the noise of the city died down, Robert found himself thinking more and more about Mary and the farm he had left behind. An internal conflict brewed within him. He had run away from the countryside, but the sense of loss refused to fade. Meanwhile, Mary returned from the fields and discovered the note. She wasn't entirely surprised. She had sensed that Robert wasn't adjusting well. But she hadn't expected him to leave so abruptly. Still, she didn't complain or blame anyone. She understood that this was his choice. However, Jack Thompson wasn't going to let things go so easily. When Jack found out about his son's escape, his face hardened with anger. To him, this wasn't just about Robert's actions, it was a personal affront to his authority and the decision he had made to save his son. Jack quickly made the necessary calls, and soon, Robert was found hiding with his friends in their upscale apartments, where the partying continued almost nonstop. One evening, as Robert returned to his friend's place after another night out, he was met by an unexpected visitor. His father sat on the couch in the apartment, a look of cold fury on his face. "Did you really think you could run away?" Jack said icily as he rose from his seat. Robert froze in place. He hadn't expected his father to find him so quickly. The internal conflict he had been battling only intensified. Part of him wanted to return, but his pride wouldn't let him admit his mistakes. "I don't have to live the life you chose for me," Robert retorted sharply, though his voice trembled. "You do," Jack said firmly. "I gave you everything, and you can't just throw it all away. You need to understand the effort that went into giving you everything you have. You're ruining my life. You forced me to marry a woman I didn't even know, and now you want me to be a farmer? This isn't me," Robert shouted angrily. Jack stepped closer, his eyes blazing with anger. "You're not a child anymore, Robert. You need to take responsibility for your life. You've hidden behind money and parties for too long. It's time to grow up." Grabbing his son by the shoulder, Jack dragged him to the car, ignoring Robert's protests. Robert tried to resist, but his father was resolute. Jack knew that if he didn't act now, his son would be lost forever. Without another word, they drove back to the farm. When they arrived, Mary was already at the house. She had expected Robert to return, but she hadn't thought it would be so soon or under these circumstances. Jack led his son inside as if he were a prisoner, his expression determined that this conversation would be the turning point. "You're staying here now," Jack said firmly, gripping his son's shoulder. "You made the decision to get married, you chose this life. Now you're going to fight for it." Robert, feeling broken and exhausted, couldn't respond. He looked at Mary, who silently watched the scene unfold. There was no judgment in her eyes, only calm and understanding. Robert suddenly realized that he hadn't been running from Mary or the farm, but from himself. "Leave us?" Mary quietly asked, addressing Jack. Jack looked at her and nodded. He was ready to give his son a second chance but didn't want to interfere any longer. He left, leaving Robert and Mary alone. Tension filled the room. Robert felt empty, knowing he had made a mistake but unable to find the words to explain. "I can't do this," he finally whispered, lowering his head. Mary stepped closer and spoke softly. "You didn't run away from me, Robert. You ran away from your life. But now you have a choice: accept this as a chance for a new life, or keep running from yourself." Robert lifted his eyes to meet hers, seeing something in her gaze that he hadn't noticed before. Mary wasn't his enemy, she wasn't the obstacle he had thought she was. She was someone who understood his inner struggle. "I don't know how to handle this," Robert admitted. "No one knows from the start," Mary replied with a gentle smile. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try." Robert sighed and covered his face with his hand. He began to realize that maybe this farm, this life, wasn't his punishment, but his salvation. The next morning, when he woke up, Robert slowly got out of bed, feeling the discomfort of the stiff mattress. He stepped out onto the porch. In the distance, he saw Mary already working in the field. She was dressed in simple clothes, her hair tied back in a ponytail. Robert watched as she moved confidently among the workers, and it puzzled him. She was so different from the women he had known in the city, those who dressed head to toe in designer brands and never lifted a finger for hard work. Watching her, Robert couldn't help but think that, despite all his hatred for the situation, there was something about Mary that both frightened and attracted him. She was confident, composed, and seemingly at peace, as if this was all second nature to her. He couldn't say the same about himself. Deciding not to laze around the house, Robert took a walk around the farm. The field stretched out to the horizon. People were working, some tending to animals, others harvesting crops. Everyone had their task, and no one paid him any attention. He was still an outsider in this village. Robert felt completely out of place. Climbing a small hill that overlooked the entire farm, Robert sat on a large rock and thought. From this height, he could see the entire property, the fields, the house, the workers. He spotted Mary again, already milking a cow, calmly and confidently doing her work without needing anyone's help. Robert watched her with a growing sense of respect that was slowly breaking through his previous contempt. She was different. That evening, during dinner, they sat across from each other in silence, as usual. Robert pushed his fork around his plate, not feeling particularly hungry. "It's different here than in the city," Mary said unexpectedly. Robert looked up, slightly surprised by her tone. There was no reproach in her voice, no hint of irritation, just a calm statement of the obvious. "No," Robert replied dryly, adding sarcastically, "of course it's not. I know this isn't what you wanted," Mary continued. "But you don't have to see it as a punishment. People here work for what they have. Maybe you should try to look at it differently." Robert smirked, unsure how to respond to her words. To him, this life would always be a step backward. But something about what she said made him think, if only for a moment. The next few days passed in much the same way. Mary rose early and carried out her daily chores on the farm, while Robert realized more and more that he had nowhere else to go. Sometimes he tried to help, but his awkwardness and inexperience quickly became apparent, and the farm workers didn't hide their surprise at his ineptitude. They didn't mock him, but Robert still felt completely out of place among them. One day, Mary approached him as he struggled to fix a fence. "If you want to live here, you'll have to learn how to do different kinds of work," she said, watching him calmly. Robert looked at her in confusion. Was she expecting him to become a handyman or, even better, start cutting hay? It seemed absurd to him. "And where do you think I should start?" he asked irritably. "With the basics," she replied with a slight smile. "There's plenty of work here, but it's not as hard as it seems. If you want, I can teach you." His pride told him to refuse, but Robert couldn't ignore her offer. There was no mockery in her voice, no disdain, just a sincere willingness to help. "All right," he finally agreed, though tension still lingered in his tone. Mary nodded and began explaining the simplest tasks to him. At first, Robert was clumsy and uninterested, but gradually, he began to get into the rhythm of the work. Physical labor, though exhausting, distracted him from his thoughts and forced him to focus on something real. Weeks went by, and life on the farm began to take on a surprising rhythm for Robert. Although he still resisted his new reality, the bitterness he felt was slowly fading. There was something calming about this lifestyle, something that made him feel less lost. He still avoided much interaction with the workers and with Mary, but he gradually got involved in the farm tasks. Despite his clumsiness, Robert started to understand how things worked here. One day, as Robert was struggling to fix the fence, trying to fit a board into place, an older man, Sam, who had been working on the farm for years, approached him. "Looks like you could use some help, young man," Sam said with a warm smile, watching Robert's awkward attempts. Robert, wanting to prove to Mary that he wasn't useless, tried to handle it himself, but he had to admit he needed assistance. "Yeah, I guess I'm not really getting it right," Robert admitted with a sheepish grin. "No worries, nobody's a master from the start," Sam replied calmly, and with swift, experienced movements, he fixed the fence in no time. "Thanks," Robert said, feeling a genuine appreciation for Sam's help. For the first time in a long while, he felt a respect for someone else's hard work. Sam patted him on the shoulder and left. Robert stayed behind, thinking about how little he knew about life outside the city. People here work not for luxury, but simply to survive. There was something honest and true in their work, and Robert was beginning to understand that. Later that evening, for the first time, Robert decided to talk to Mary about more than just formalities. They sat at the small kitchen table, and Robert watched her prepare dinner with the same efficiency she used while working on the farm. "I fixed the fence today," Robert said unexpectedly, hoping for some acknowledgement. Mary paused for a moment, surprised that he had initiated a conversation. "And how did it go?" she asked, continuing to chop vegetables. "Well, not by myself," Robert admitted with a laugh. "Sam helped me. I guess I'm not as good at it as I thought." Mary smiled as she glanced over her shoulder. "Everything comes with time," she said softly. "The important thing is that you're trying." Robert fell silent again, but his thoughts were racing. He had expected Mary to laugh or criticize him for his lack of skills, but she never did. Her words were always simple and sincere. It left him somewhat puzzled but also strangely comforted. The days continued to pass, and although Robert still felt like an outsider, he found himself becoming more engaged in farm life. He began to understand the people who worked here, and though this world was once foreign to him, it was slowly becoming familiar. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the hills, Mary paused for a moment, gazing at the sunset. She had been working in the fields all day, and now that the work was done, she stood, appreciating the beauty of nature. Robert, standing nearby, noticed her. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to enjoy the moment. The sunset was indeed beautiful, not like the ones he used to see in the city. There, sunsets were hidden behind towering buildings. Here, on the farm, the sunset was real, natural, and simple. "It's beautiful," Mary suddenly said, still looking at the horizon. Robert nodded, surprised at himself. He couldn't remember the last time he had paid attention to something as simple as a sunset. "Yeah, it is," he agreed quietly. Mary glanced at him for a moment but said nothing more. She could see that something was beginning to change in Robert. It wasn't love, not yet. But something deeper than mere obligation was starting to form between them. Months passed, and Robert's life on the farm began to take on a new rhythm. He no longer simply lazed around, instead, he actively helped with the work. It wasn't that he enjoyed it, but it gave him something to focus on. Slowly, Robert began to feel a sense of satisfaction from the tasks he completed. It was an unfamiliar feeling, he had never felt this way before in his life of luxury. One evening, after a long day's work, Robert returned to the house and saw Mary already preparing dinner. Usually, they sat at the table in silence, but this time, Robert decided he wanted to help. He picked up a knife and began chopping vegetables beside her, not saying a word. Mary looked at him with surprise but didn't comment. In the silence, there was a mutual understanding. They were no longer just two strangers forced to live together. Something more genuine was beginning to take root between them. "I never thought I'd be doing this," Robert said with a small smile, glancing at the vegetables. "Cutting vegetables or living on a farm?" Mary asked with a grin. "Both," Robert admitted. "But I guess life has a way of surprising you." Mary nodded, continuing her work, but in her eyes, there was a glimmer of understanding. She knew Robert was changing, and that change was for the better. After dinner, Robert went for a walk around the farm. It had become his evening routine. Walking helped him clear his mind. He still felt like an outsider in many ways, but more and more, his old desires and habits were fading into the background. One evening, after a particularly hard day, Mary suddenly spoke up. "Robert," she began, clearing the table after dinner, "you've changed. You're not the same man who arrived here months ago." Robert looked up, surprised by her observation. "You think so?" he asked with a faint smile. "Yes, Mary said firmly. You've become different. You care about the people here, you work, you help? Robert thought for a moment. Maybe she was right. The insane idea his father had forced on him was actually making a difference in his life. Maybe you're right, he admitted. I used to think the world revolved around me and my pleasures. But here, I've started to see that life is both more complicated and simpler. Everything here has a purpose. Mary listened quietly. She didn't need to say anything, but her eyes spoke volumes. She understood what he meant. They sat together, feeling that their bond was growing stronger with each passing day. One day, while they were working in the field, Robert suddenly stopped and looked at Mary. Mary, have you ever thought about living differently? He asked. Mary turned to him, puzzled by his question. What do you mean? She asked. I mean, maybe we could change things. We could find a balance between this life and what I had before, Robert suggested, for the first time openly talking about their future. Mary remained silent for a few moments, considering his words. Are you saying you don't want to stay here forever? She finally asked. Robert sighed, unsure of how to respond. I don't know, he said honestly. I'm starting to appreciate this life. But I think we could balance life on the farm with life in the city. Mary smiled gently. There was understanding in her gaze. She knew that Robert was caught between two worlds, and she understood that he needed time to find his way. Maybe you're right, she said after a pause. Maybe there is room for both of our worlds. This conversation marked the beginning of their discussions about the future. Over time, Robert and Mary grew closer, not just as two people forced into a situation but as partners supporting each other. Life on the farm had brought them together, and Robert had begun to realize the value of the life Mary had shown him. They started spending time not only working but also talking about their hopes and dreams. Eventually, what began as an arrangement turned into genuine affection, which blossomed into love. Several months passed, and one day Mary, nervous but excited, shared important news with Robert. Robert, she said, approaching him slowly, I have something to tell you. Robert looked at her with a hint of worry. Is something wrong? He asked, sensing the gravity in her words. I'm pregnant, Mary said with a smile, though her eyes revealed a mix of excitement and fear. For a moment, Robert stood frozen. He hadn't expected this news, but then a genuine smile spread across his face. Are you serious? He asked, pulling her into an embrace. We're going to be parents? Although Robert was happy, he also realized that raising a child would not be easy. He understood that now, more than ever, he had to step up and embrace the responsibilities ahead. A few days later, Jack Thompson visited the farm again. This time, his visit wasn't filled with the tension of their previous encounters. He wanted to see how his son was doing and hear about the progress he had made. Jack had always been a man of firm resolve, rarely showing his emotions, but this visit was different. Mary had informed him about Robert's transformation, but Jack wanted to see it with his own eyes. As Jack stepped out of the car, Robert met him at the gate. The two exchanged silent looks, and the tension between them was palpable. Both knew that this conversation would be pivotal. So, how do you like it here? Jack asked, studying his son carefully. Robert hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. This place has changed me, he finally admitted. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad I ended up here. Jack, though surprised, didn't show it. He knew that his plan had worked, but he hadn't expected such a result. I'm glad to hear it, Jack responded, keeping his emotions in check. I always knew this life would teach you something. Robert smiled, but this time it wasn't one of sarcasm, but of genuine gratitude. He realized now that despite all the harshness, his father's plan had indeed helped him grow. I think I understand now, Dad, Robert said softly, why you sent me here. You wanted me to learn what it means to truly work for something, to take responsibility. And, it's working. Jack's stern expression softened for a brief moment, something rare for him. He had always been a tough man, but seeing his son mature filled him with a quiet satisfaction. I always wanted you to understand that life isn't about luxury, but about making something of yourself, Jack said, his voice carrying a rare hint of pride. They walked into the house to join Mary for lunch. As they sat at the table, Jack noticed Mary seemed a bit nervous. She kept glancing at Robert, and Jack picked up on the unspoken tension. Is there something I should know? Jack asked, a curious edge to his voice. Mary took a deep breath, looking at Robert for reassurance before speaking. We have some news for you, Mary said, her voice steady but with a hint of excitement. Jack raised an eyebrow, waiting for the announcement. We're expecting a baby, Mary said, smiling nervously. You're going to be a grandfather? Jack froze for a moment, processing the words. He had been so focused on guiding his son toward responsibility that he hadn't considered the possibility of his family growing. The idea of becoming a grandfather had never crossed his mind. A baby? Jack repeated, looking from Mary to Robert. His stern demeanor softened, and slowly, a rare smile appeared on his face. Well, that's wonderful news. I couldn't have imagined better news than this. Jack stood and embraced his son in an uncharacteristically warm gesture. For a man who rarely showed emotion, it was a moment of genuine affection. You've surprised me, Robert, Jack said with a smile. But I'm proud of you. Robert, caught off guard by his father's approval, smiled back. Thank you, Dad. I guess I'm finally learning. And I came prepared, Jack added, his tone now lighter. I have something for you. Robert looked at his father in surprise. A gift? Yes, Jack nodded. You've shown me that you've matured, that you can handle responsibility. So, I've decided to give you a share of the business. You're no longer just my son, you'll be my partner. It's time for you to learn how to earn your own way, and I'll be here to guide you if needed. Robert was stunned. This wasn't just any gift, it was a new opportunity, a way to start a life for himself and his family, to prove that he had truly changed. I don't know what to say, Robert replied, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. This is a huge responsibility. Jack placed a reassuring hand on Robert's shoulder. I know you can handle it. You've already proven that you're willing to work hard and take responsibility. Now, you'll get to show that in the business world too. Robert and Mary moved back to the city, where Robert took on his new role in managing part of his father's company. They started building their new life together in a new home, balancing the demands of the business with their growing family. However, they never forgot about the farm. Every weekend, they would return to the countryside, to the place where their love had blossomed, finding solace away from the city's chaos. Months later, their daughter was born, a moment of pure joy that brought even more meaning to their lives. Mary took care of their daughter, and despite the challenges of managing a business, Robert worked hard to secure a bright future for his family. At first, managing the company wasn't easy for Robert. The corporate world was far more complex than he had imagined, filled with financial and managerial challenges that required his constant attention. There were moments when he felt overwhelmed, unsure if he could meet his father's expectations. But Jack was always there, offering support and advice. He taught Robert how to make tough decisions, lead a team, and be a true leader. Slowly, Robert began to understand what it meant to be responsible not only for himself but for an entire organization. Years passed, and Robert became a successful businessman. The company, which he had inherited a share of, thrived under his management. He had grown into a capable and confident leader, capable of handling the toughest situations. But despite his success in the business world, the most important thing to him remained his family. Every weekend, they returned to the farm, which had become a sanctuary for their family, a place where they could escape from the pressures of the city and reconnect with nature. Looking back, Robert realized how far he had come. He now had a life he could be proud of, a balance between the bustling city and the peaceful countryside, between career and family. He had learned to value both the world of business and the simplicity of life on the farm. And Jack, seeing his son's transformation, knew that all his efforts had been worthwhile. Robert had become not only a successful businessman but also a good man, someone who had found his path. Though the journey had been long and filled with challenges, Robert, Mary, and their daughter faced the future with confidence and joy. Their family had grown stronger, and they had built a life full of love, hard work, and balance. And in the end, Robert understood that everything his father had done was out of love, to help him grow into the man he was meant to be. Now, as he looked toward the future with his own family, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. Thank you for listening to the story. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to the Tell Me a Story channel and share this video with your friends and family. Your support motivates us to keep working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next exciting tale, which will be appearing on your screen soon. We are deeply grateful for your presence. In the description below, you can find the full catalog of all our stories. See you next time.